Hello and welcome back once more to History for the HSC, as we continue with our series of deep dives into the power and authority topic for the HSC Modern History course. In today's video, we're going to think a little bit about the impact of the Nazi regime on the religious practices of Germans. There's going to be a lot to say about it, so let's get going. In today's video, as we consider religious belief and practices in Germany under the Nazis, we will think about this following main syllabus outcome. The impact of the Nazi regime on life in Germany, including cultural expression, religion, workers, youth, and minorities, including Jews. We will, of course, be focusing on the religion aspect of this outcome. But as we mentioned in our last video, as we consider what this outcome means, we need to think about what religion was like prior to the Nazis, as well as what it was like after them, and what actions the regime undertook that caused that change. In our discussion today, we're also going to touch upon several other distinct syllabus outcomes. Firstly, we'll consider opposition to the Nazi regime and what role various religious groups played in that. And secondly, we'll come back to consider and mention some events in the Nazi consolidation of power, as a need to assert their control over the church was one of the first major goals of the regime. Let's then break this down into a few smaller chunks. Firstly, we'll consider the Catholic Church in Germany, both how it was impacted by the regime, but also how its actions in opposition to Nazi power caused at least some impact. Secondly, we're going to spend some time considering the Protestant Church in Germany, again considering the attacks of the Nazi regime on the larger Protestant group, and also discussing and to an extent evaluating how effective their opposition to Hitler was. Thirdly, we'll look at how the Nazis attempted to control religion and Nazify believers through the formation of what was called the Reich Church. Before lastly, we will have a look at the attacks of the Nazi regime on the Jehovah's Witnesses as one of the many groups that were targeted by the Nazis for terror and oppression. Now, at this point, we should probably say it could really be argued that we should also at this juncture discuss the impact of the Nazi regime on Jewish religion in Germany, for it certainly had a massive impact. However, we will discuss the Holocaust as it was in a later video. And the Nazi attacks on Jews really had very little, if anything, to do with Jewish religion and everything to do with their social Darwinistic racist ideology, as would be shown by the fact they would also attack Jews who had converted to Christianity. So with all of that said, let's get started. Now, Catholicism was a major religious presence in the German state well before the rise of Nazism. In the 1933 census, the year that the Nazis would come to power, some 32.5% of the population would report to be Catholic. Catholicism in Germany was far more common in the southern and the western states, places like Bavaria and the Rhineland, and it had an organized structure. There were 19 bishops, some 20,000 priests in the 1930s, and not to mention it held close ties with the Vatican and with the worldwide Catholic Church. As such, they presented something of a social counterpoint to Nazism, an organized group who might be able to sway a significant amount of the population in order to oppose the regime. And indeed, in the lead up to Hitler being made chancellor, in the years during the rise of the Nazi Party, the Catholic Church in Germany had remained virtually unanimous in their opposition to the party. And beyond this, their political activities through the Catholic Centre Party meant that the church offered not only a religious and social opposition, but political opposition as well. In this competition, it was crucial for Hitler and the Nazis to win. And this was why they were so keen to sign the Reich Concordat in July 1933. Now, we've already discussed this in an earlier video on the consolidation of power, so if you want to know a little bit more about that, have a look at the video that's being linked just there. But suffice to say, this agreement with the Vatican and the Nazi regime was able to remove for the Nazis the political opponents in the Centre Party and to severely limit, although not completely quash, the ability of the Catholic Church in general in Germany to provide any reasonable opposition. And in return, the Church was promised protection, in line with what was supposed to be part of Nazi ideology. Hitler's 25-point plan had, after all, promised religious freedom in Germany. But this supposed protection of the state meant very little when key members of the regime retained very strong anti-church beliefs. Hitler saw the church as a threat. Goebbels, perhaps more than any other, prioritized his attacks on the church and the clergy. Himmler saw very little difference between the politically minded cleric and the Jew in terms of their opposition to the regime. The Nazi theorist Alfred Rosenberg argued that the Catholic Church should be completely removed. He saw them as the primary enemy of National Socialism. Indeed, Rosenberg himself was a neo-pagan, a new belief effectively invented by the Nazis, drawing back on the ancient pre-Christian pagan beliefs of Germany. So these supposed protections of the Concordat meant little, and of the estimated 20,000 priests in Germany in 1933, as we mentioned earlier, some 1/3 would face some sort of persecution due to their supposed anti-party actions. And over 2,500 priests, both from within Germany and the occupied territories, in particular Poland, would be incarcerated in the Dachau concentration camp. Catholic priests would indeed make up 95% of all the religious leaders that were imprisoned in concentration camps. As the attacks on the church increased, the papacy could no longer remain silent, and in the early months of 1937, Pope Pius XI would issue with burning concern, expressing his thoughts on the regime. It was perhaps the first official condemnation of the regime distributed throughout the parishes of Germany, and despite the best efforts of the Gestapo to stop it. With burning concern, would speak out against the attacks on the church. Some have claimed it made fairly thinly veiled attacks on Hitler himself in this particular quote. Should any man dare, in sacrilegious disregard of the essential differences between God and his creature, that being man, he would deserve to be called a prophet of nothingness, to whom the terrifying words of Scripture would be applicable. He that dwelleth in heaven shall laugh at them. Psalm 2, verse 3. The prophet of nothingness, supposedly a fairly thinly veiled attack on Hitler himself, although historians do debate that somewhat. In the end, with burning concern would only result in increased attacks on more and more Catholic clergy being targeted and sent to concentration camps. But as for the church itself, membership actually increased. By 1939, 33.1% of the population would identify as Catholic. And now we come to look at two key leaders of the Catholic Church in Germany and how their opposition and their involvement with Nazism is a difficult thing to kind of get our heads around. And the first of these is Cardinal Michael von Faulhaber, the Archbishop of Munich. And his attitude towards the Nazi Party was frankly complicated. In 1923, he'd been instrumental in convincing one Gustav von Kahr not to support Hitler. Now, for context, to understand why that's significant, von Kahr was one of the three men that Hitler had taken captive during his failed Beerputsch. One of the three men Hitler hoped to convince to support him and Ludendorff to turn on the Weimar regime. And Faulhaber had convinced him not to support Hitler. Beyond this, Faulhaber had been co-founder of what's called the Amici Israel Group, or what was called the Amici Israel Group in the Vatican, which aimed to achieve reconciliation between the Jews and Christians, so he's not an anti-Semite. But that being said, when the Nazis came to power through legal means, he would actually encourage the Catholic Church to obey them as the duly elected government. This didn't necessarily mean agreeing with Nazi ideology, as Faulhaber's own sermons made it clear he opposed many of the actions taken by the government. In his Advent sermons in 1933, he would state, "No Roman Catholic approves of the persecutions of Jews in Germany." He'd further take part in the negotiations of the Reich's Concordat and write to congratulate Hitler on achieving his dictatorial power through the Enabling Act, calling on God to preserve the Reich Chancellor for the people. Faulhaber would also meet with Hitler several times, supposedly somehow hoping to work within the regime to improve life. And to this day, because of these things, Faulhaber remains a somewhat controversial figure. Whilst it seems fairly clear that he was not himself a supporter of the regime, and indeed he did speak out against them, he didn't speak out a lot, and he seems to work with them at times. And so it remains up for debate. Is it fair to criticize, say he should have done more? He should have done more to oppose the wrongs of the regime. Or perhaps did he walk a tightrope and say as much as really he could? Really, in the end, I'm going to leave that to you to decide. But a second Catholic cardinal we should spend some time considering is Clemens von Galen. During the years of Nazi rule, he would serve as Bishop of Munster. He'd later, after the war, be elevated to the position of cardinal. He, in fact, was made Bishop of Munster in September of 1933, so the year that Hitler had taken power. His attacks on the church were probably, well, they were, in fact, more consistent than Faulhaber's. He would speak out against Nazi control of schools, against the removal of crucifixes or crosses from those schools. He, along with Faulhaber, would help write the With Burning Concern address from the Pope to German Catholics, and his sermons would frequently speak out against Nazi ideology. Perhaps, however, his best-known confrontation with the Nazi state would come in terms of his protest against the Action T4 program, its voluntary euthanasia of the mentally and physically disabled. His sermons and denunciations of these actions would lead to such public outcry that the regime would be forced to back down. In a series of sermons in 1941, he would say, "Where in Germany and where here is obedience to the precepts of God, to the laws of God?" He would go on to call out Nazi ideology, which placed Hitler in a godlike position, reminding his listeners of one of the 10 Commandments, "Thou shalt not have any God above me." And he would go further to call out the program of euthanasia with another of the 10 Commandments, "Thou shalt not kill." Von Galen, like Faulhaber, wouldn't seek to overthrow the regime. He sought to work within it and to speak out against its errors as he saw them. And so with all that said, what impact did the Nazi regime actually have on the Catholic Church? Well, politically, they were silenced, though not completely, as they still did find ways to speak out against the totalitarian control the Nazis sought. Their opposition, however, was largely ineffective, at least in terms of the worst successes of the regime, although perhaps you could argue that maybe worse would have happened without men like Faulhaber and von Galen speaking out against what did happen. In the end, we don't really know. It's basically impossible to prove. In terms of the Nazi desires, however, to quash the impact of the church and society and the ideology of the German people, the Nazis too were ineffective. By 1946, some 35.9% of the population would identify as Catholic. In fact, that percentage had grown throughout the years of Nazi rule. Some 13 years of Nazi rule amounted to no discernible impact in the power of the church in the end. Let's now come to think about the larger of the Christian churches in Germany, and that is the Protestant Church. By far, this was the largest religious group in all of Germany. Some 62.7% of the population of Germany belonged to a Protestant church. And the Protestant church had been a major part of German society and culture for a long, long time. In many ways, it was considered to be more German than the Catholic Church, more acceptable than the Catholic Church. The Protestant Reformation had, after all, begun in Germany. What this means, if you think about it, is between the Catholic and Protestant Christian churches, somewhere around 98% of the population could be included. Both Christian religions with key similarities in beliefs, however, fundamental differences. And these differences drastically impacted the way the Nazi regime was able to have an impact on the Protestant church. Chief among these differences were the organizational difference, where the Catholic Church was a single group, united as part of the worldwide Catholic Church and the power it wielded internationally. The Protestant churches in Germany were different. They were distinct. There were Lutherans, there were Reformed, there were uniting churches, and many, many more. The Protestant churches differed on the religious beliefs among them, on their political beliefs among them, and this was a weakness that the Nazis were able to exploit. Some denominations openly opposed Hitler and the Nazis. Other denominations supported them. And these divisions made the Protestant churches the key target in what's called the Nazi Kirchenkampf, or church struggle. This was essentially the attempt to control and Nazify religion within the Reich. They weren't really able to do this against the organized Catholic Church, but against the smaller groups of Protestants, they found far more success. We'll look in a minute or two at what this looked like, but for now, let's spend some time looking at the groups of Protestant churches who opposed the Nazi regime. The most well-known of these groups was the Confessing Church. Nazi attempts to mold Christian religious practices to match their ideology, particularly requiring only Aryan people to be made priests effectively in Protestant churches, caused an outcry led by Martin Niemöller. As a group, the Confessing Church sought not so much to bring down the regime, but to prevent its involvement in the theology of the churches, to preserve the independence of the churches. And we'll see why this was so important to them in a minute when we see how those who supported the Nazi regime within the church were acting. Some of these men who would spoke out openly against all aspects of the regime, including its treatment of Jews and other minorities. Others, like Niemöller, at least initially, were only really concerned with Nazi interference in Christian doctrine. For his actions against the regime, Niemöller would be detained and imprisoned in Dachau, where he remained from 1938 until 1945, and these years had a profound effect on Niemöller. He'd in fact been an early sort of supporter of the Nazis. He hadn't actually been a member of the party, but he supported them. He was a conservative. He'd opposed the Weimar Republic, and he saw Hitler coming to power as a good thing initially. But the time and the ability to reflect that came with being a prisoner of this very regime enabled him to see the errors of his ways and led to a change of heart. In an interview which was published in 1941 by a former cellmate at Dachau, Niemöller reflected and related this regret clearly. When he was asked, "How could you have ever supported the Nazis?" he replied, "I find myself wondering about that too. I still wonder about it, as much as I regret it. Still, it is true that Hitler betrayed me. I had an audience with him as a representative of the Protestant Church shortly before he became Chancellor in 1932. Hitler promised me on his word of honor to protect the church and not to issue any anti-church laws. He also agreed not to allow pogroms against the Jews, assuring me as follows: there will be no restrictions against the Jews, there will be restrictions against the Jews, but there will be no ghettos, no pogroms in Germany." I really believed him. Given the widespread anti-Semitism in Germany at the time, that Jews should avoid aspiring to government positions or seats in the Reichstag. There are many Jews, especially among the Zionists, who took a similar stand. Hitler's assurance satisfied me at the time. On the other hand, I hated the growing atheistic movement, which was fostered and promoted by the Social Democrats and the Communists. Their hostility toward the church made me pin my hopes on Hitler for a while. I'm paying for that mistake now. And not me alone, but thousands of other persons like me. In the end, then, Niemöller's story is not so much of one of protest and opposition, but of facing his own involvement in the actions of the Nazi state, his own failures to adequately speak out. It is one thing he never did was deny his own responsibility. And it was this that led him to pen his famous First They Came confessional. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. The Protestant Church was largely less effective in fighting back against Nazi interference, and as we'll see in a minute, some groups of the church never sought to fight back at all. But in the end, the party wasn't ever really able to create any lasting change in Protestant religion in Germany. By 1946, some 59% of the population still identified as Protestant. The years of Nazi rule had not made a significant difference. Now, we mentioned earlier that the Protestant Church in Germany was far less organized than their Catholic counterpart. There had been some small amount of coordination through what was called the German Evangelical Church Confederation, and this coordinated some sort of organizational conflicts between the churches and had made some steps toward coming to consensus on some theological doctrinal issues that had split the churches. There'd even been some discussion earlier on of unifying all of the Protestant churches in Germany under the one banner of the German Evangelical Church Confederation, but this was never fulfilled in the Weimar period, as the differences between the various denominations continued into the period of Nazi rule. This would all change when, in 1933, the organization would be rebranded as simply the German Evangelical Church, otherwise known as the Reich Church. And the reason for this rebranding comes largely from the actions of a group called the Deutsche, or the German Christians. These were effectively a group of Nazi supporters within the Protestant churches in Germany, who by 1933 had been elected to enough positions of leadership within the various churches. This gave them a large majority, and they were actually able to begin pushing towards a more unified Protestant church in Germany under Nazi rule, under the banner of the Reich Church and the leadership of one Ludwig Müller. Müller and the Deutsche Christians were attempting to Nazify Protestant beliefs in Germany, bringing the predominantly Protestant population of the Reich on board with the party's ideology. Specifically, they argued that, firstly, Adolf Hitler is the completion of the Reformation. Secondly, baptized Jews are to be dismissed from the church. And thirdly, that the Old Testament is to be excluded from the sacred scriptures. This movement would make clear its beliefs, stating, "The eternal God has created for our nation a law that is peculiar to its own kind. It took shape in the leader Adolf Hitler and in the National Socialist state created by him. This law speaks to us from the history of our people. It is loyalty to this law which demands of us the battle for honor and freedom. One nation, one God, one Reich, one church." And indeed, it was largely for these doctrinal issues and interference that Niemöller and the other members of the confessing church sought to separate themselves. The Deutsche Christians would point to Martin Luther, the German founder of the Protestant Reformation. However, along with reforming the doctrine of the church, Luther was also known as having espoused many very anti-Semitic views. Luther argued, for instance, "What shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? First, set fire to their synagogues or schools. This is to be done in honor of our Lord and Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed." And he went on to further encourage targeting attacks of oppression against the Jews. Modern historiography is somewhat divided on the role of Luther in the development of anti-Semitism that the Nazis had. Himmler, for instance, would write of his admiration of Luther's sermons on the Jews. Julius Streicher, the editor of the Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer, would describe Luther's sermons as the most radically anti-Semitic tract ever produced. Luther's sermons would be displayed at the Nuremberg rallies, where the Nazis' very racial laws would be announced. In the end, the fact that Luther wrote extensively anti-Semitic messages is not really up for debate. It's a clear historical fact. And the fact that the Nazis used these messages to promote their own ideology is also clear. But the question does remain is whether this usage by the Nazis was opportunistic. It was a way to buy into the Protestant belief that was so popular in the population and gain the support of the large group of people that fit into the Protestant Church, particularly at this point of history, with the interest in Luther being heightened as they approached the 400th anniversary of his birth. It's clear, on the other hand, that Luther's attacks on the Jews were of a religious nature. He didn't attack them as a racial group, rather he attacked them for failing to recognize the Messiah, Jesus in his mind, the Messiah that they were supposedly looking forward to. The concept of racial anti-Semitism, such as what the Nazis held, doesn't really fit into Luther's teaching. The reality, I guess, is that for every historian that draws a straight line between Luther's writings and Nazi ideology, another will point out massive differences. And it is really very unclear how much of an impact Luther had on Nazism. However, it is equally clear the Nazis did use Luther's works to promote themselves. Eventually, the Nazis would seemingly lose interest in the Reich Church. It had been unable to bring about the unification of the Protestant churches under Nazi ideology that they'd hoped. However, the Reich Church would continue to act throughout the rest of Nazi rule. This was a sign of the permeating, in fact, influence and impact of Nazi ideology on all aspects of German society. However, it would no longer receive the same level of official government support from the party. Now, a special mention should really be made about the impact of the Nazi state on Jehovah's Witnesses. Of all the various religious groups that were targeted by the Nazis, the Jehovah's Witnesses faced perhaps the most consistent level of oppression. That is, of course, outside of the Jews. As I've said earlier, the Jews were targeted primarily for racial reasons rather than theological arguments. And so they are somewhat of a different case. Regardless, some 10,000 of the witnesses were imprisoned throughout the period of Nazi rule, and there are only around 30,000 witnesses in the whole of Germany to begin with. 2,000 witnesses would be sent into concentration camps. 1,200 of them would die in custody. And in these camps, they would be made to wear the purple triangle, the symbol of what they're imprisoned for, much like the Jewish Star of David or the pink triangle that was worn by the homosexual prisoners. The Nazis liked to be able to identify why a person had been placed in a concentration camp. The witnesses were the first Christian group to be banned by the regime. They faced unemployment, a loss of pensions. They were expelled from schools and other places of learning. But why? What was the cause of this oppression? Why did the Jehovah's Witnesses make themselves such a target for Nazi oppression? To put it simply, their ideology and that of the Nazis was simply incompatible. And specifically, their belief in an all-powerful God, Jehovah, clashed with the Nazi concept of the Führer, Adolf Hitler, in a way other Christian denominations didn't quite have. As historian Michael Cater puts it, while the National Socialists accepted the Führer state, the earnest Bible students, the witnesses, submitted to the theocracy, in which not the Führer, but Jehovah was the dictatorial ruler. In practice, what this meant was that witnesses would refuse to give the Hitler salute, refuse to fight in the nation's army, to participate in parades, or to swear loyalty to the regime, and it was for this that they were targeted. And unlike many other groups targeted by the regime, they had a way of actually avoiding punishment, a renunciation of their faith. Witnesses were primarily Aryan Germans, and if they renounced, gave up their faith, they would be set free. This particular renunciation of faith document, for instance, comes from the Dachau concentration camp. And by signing it, a witness who was an inmate of that camp would just go free. They only had to agree to this following statement. I acknowledge that the International Association of Jehovah's Witnesses advocates a false doctrine using their religious activities as a pretext in the pursuit of subversive aims. I've therefore totally rejected this organization and have freed myself emotionally from the sect. I hereby undertake never again to work for the International Association of Jehovah's Witnesses. I shall report any persons who approach me with the false doctrine of Jehovah's Witnesses, or those who in any way display sympathy for them. Should I receive any Jehovah's Witnesses literature, I shall surrender it immediately to the nearest police station. I shall in future observe the laws of the nation, especially in the event of war, when I shall take up arms to defend my fatherland and strive to become a wholehearted member of the national community. I have been informed that I must expect a further term of protective custody if I fail to observe the undertaking which I make today. All it would take to avoid the punishments. All it would take to avoid the executions. And yet, so many failed to do so. And as for the success of these oppressive measures of the regime against the Jehovah's Witnesses, how many submitted? How many renounced their faith? Well, the church in the years following Nazi rule would number 20,000. 1/3 of its members had either renounced their faith to avoid punishment or had fled the country for safety. And indeed, a far larger proportion of them had just fled for safety. This has been History for the HSC and our latest deep dive into the power and authority topic. Today, we have delved into the impact of the regime on religious belief and practices within the Reich. Now remember, you can download this end screen as a poster using the links in the description below. A similar video and the subscribe button should be on the screen round about now. You can use either if you want. Next time, we'll be asking a very important question on impact. What impact did this National Socialist German Workers' Party have on the very workers that it supposedly represented? But until then, keep on studying.